Thank you, Ken. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with Mike. Mike and I see enough of each other in Washington and in Asia, but I'm always happy to be with him. And Ken, who I haven't seen in a while, it's really a pleasure. I look around the room, there are lots of people, lots of familiar faces, and I'm happy to see many of them. So we don't have much time in our presentations, and these panels move very quickly, I can tell, because when you sit down in the presenter's chair, it's still warm from the last person who sat down in the chair. But I'm going to talk about U.S. alliances and the emerging architecture in Asia. And the reason that I'm doing this topic as part of the Asia Policy Assembly was that when I was in the government on the National Security Council, I took a trip to Asia with the Deputy National Security Advisor, then J.D. Crouch, Laura's dad. And he said that he's an academic, I'm an academic. He said, one of the things that we really need to think about is what is going to be the architecture of Asia and how does the U.S. alliance system fit in? Does it fit in at all? Are these two things compatible? Are we relying on one thing while the rest of Asia is looking for something else? So you got to figure out what that is. You have to think about what that is. Are the alliances in Asia, as the Chinese have said, anachronisms of the Cold War? Is our bilateral alliance structure an anachronism? And so I did. I looked at this when I left and returned to academia, and kind of walked in with the assumptions that the conventional wisdom, I think, is that we're not doing very well in terms of thinking about architecture, that indeed the region is looking for new forms of indigenous organization, and we're kind of clinging to our old alliance structure from the Cold War. That's sort of the conventional view out there about when you think about architecture. And I think with this paper, what I found was that the future, in terms of the alliances and architecture, may not be as dim as people think it is. There is clearly a definitive architecture emerging and evolving in Asia that the United States and its allies support. It is not one dominated by China, and it is not one that is characterized by a diminishing U.S. presence. However, there is a clear security dilemma involved when we think about the alliances and architecture, and that is that efforts initiated by the United States and its allies to organize regionally are always seen as latent attempts to contain China, while regional or China-initiated proposals are always seen as attempts to exclude the United States. So there is a dilemma there. But I do think that non-zero-sum solutions are possible. And I think they're in particular possible if we carry or think about three core assumptions and beliefs about architecture and about what works best in terms of architecture in Asia. And the first assumption is that no single institution shall define the region. That is, there is always this constant comparison to NATO, the notion that you have a single umbrella organization in Europe, but you don't have one in Asia, therefore architecture is deficient in Asia. And so the first assumption that I would say is that people need to internalize in their thinking about regional architecture that there is no single umbrella architecture for the region, and there will be no single umbrella architecture for the region, despite EAS and talk of other architecture. And the reasons for this, there are many. Some of them are historical. I talk about them in the international security piece that came out earlier this year, having to do with geography, post-colonial identities, all this other stuff. But the prescriptive point here is that the expectation that the answer to architecture is a single organization is not correct for Asia. The second assumption is that ad hoc institutions work better than formal ones in Asia. That essentially what we have seen over time is that the regional groupings that are the most effective in terms of organizing and solving a problem are the ones that form on an ad hoc basis among the most interested players to deal with a tangible problem. The example that I was faced very personally with when I was in the government was the tsunami, the South and Southeast Asian tsunami, where a group was formed immediately, the core group of the United States, Japan, India, and Australia. They fashioned an immediate response. As Undersecretary Grossman likes to say, this was an organization that had no secretariat. It had no formal meetings. It was done by telephone, and its success was defined by its dissolution. In other words, once it set up the initial response and helped to formulate the infrastructure that allowed other agencies to come in. So that's another one, that ad hoc institutions work better than formal ones. And then the third is that bilateral and multilateral institutions are mutually reinforcing. Again, the conventional wisdom is that bilateralism and multilateralism operate at odds with one another in regional architecture in Asia. It's either the alliances or it's a regional formation of countries. But in fact, if you look, the most successful regional efforts have been ones in which you've had a multilateral grouping that has been based on or drew a lot of their resources from pre-existing very strong bilateral relationships. And again, the example that I used in the paper was the tsunami response, massive movements of forces and resources to the region on essentially a 48-hour timeline that could not have been possible without pre-existing bilateral relationships between the United States and India, Australia, and Japan. So if we accept these three assumptions as they're laid out, then the emerging architecture in Asia, again, is not a single institution, but it really is a patchwork of bilateral and plurilateral groupings that are organized on a functional basis to solve a problem. Some of these groupings stay together and take on a more formal institutional structure. Others simply come apart when the problem is dealt with. The model for this sort of regional community, therefore, is not civilizational. It's not where a particular Asianist defines the group, whether it's Hatayama's East Asia Community Concept or any others, nor is it akin to something we saw in Western Europe. Instead, it is much more akin to a business model, where coalitions form among entities to solve a particular problem. The countries that have the most vested in the problem and the most resources at their disposal are the ones